The digital art era is here. AI and art creation tools empower anyone to make it. Blockchain technologies allow anyone to own it. VR, AR, and extended reality immerse us in it. Let's talk to artists and innovators behind the visual magic. I'm your host, Roger Dickerman. Welcome to the future of art. Today, we welcome Ryan Koopmans. Ryan is an artist exploring the relationship between nature and architecture, how societies have been shaped by built environments. He has sold work at Sotheby's and SuperRare. He's been collected by Jim Carey. Yes, that Jim Carey. Ryan is thoughtful about his art, his minting, his use of mechanics, and his collectors. He has a strong long-term vantage point, and that really shines through in this interview. You'll enjoy it. Let's get to it. Ryan Koopmans, welcome to the future of art.
Thank you so much, and really happy to be here. Nice to speak with you.
Happy to have this dialogue. You're someone who, I said this off recording just now, you're someone who I've been very aware of. It's hard not to be how you carry yourself in this space, and obviously the art that you lead with. So we're going to break it all down. I want to dig into it all, your perspective on it. But first, of course, Ryan, what does art mean to you?
Well, that's a great question, and I think that the first thing I would say is that every individual person would answer that question very differently. I think that art means something to each person in their own unique way. So, to speak for myself, I think that what art means to me is the freedom to explore my curiosities. It's the vehicle in which I interact with the world, and the work that I create reflects who I am, and who I am is reflected in the work. So it's the essence of who I am.
So two words that you lead with often are nature and architecture. Can you break those down?
Yeah, so I've long been interested in the relationship between the natural world and the what I call built environment. So not specifically architecture, but that can be urban planning, or the human-made imprint on the planet through infrastructure. And that interest has taken different forms over the years, whether it's been photography projects that look at the way that megacities incorporate nature into the urban plan to either express like a national ideal or an ideological statement, which you can often find in certain countries, to more contemporary work that looks at the passing of time and how there's this sort of cyclical relationship between nature and architecture, in that you remove the natural world to build a city or a building, and then over time nature slowly takes back over that space. So there's this sort of tension but symbiosis, and an ongoing, constantly evolving relationship between the two that mirror each other quite a bit as well, as far as like geometry and sort of mathematical forms that can be found in nature, as well as certain types of architecture. So I just find the two to be really like compelling subject matter that has a lot of conflict as well as a lot of similarities.
Can you trace back the origin of where that fascination started?
So I initially actually planned to be an architect, and then just before my graduate program in architecture started, during that portfolio making process, I started taking pictures and thought I'd maybe include some visuals in that portfolio. Long story short, through the process of taking photographs, this was maybe 20 years ago or so now, I fell in love with that ability, that sort of instant ability to convey something, as well as what the camera enabled me to do as far as accessing different socio-cultural groups and different scenarios and whatnot. It just like opened all these kind of doors to of that I could follow with curiosity. And it led to traveling the world and working as a photojournalist and a documentary photographer for many years in all different sort of subject matter. Um, However, what slowly started to emerge again was that the strongest work that I was creating often involved architectural subject matter. And it all has sort of come full circle over the last, 5 or so years, or up to 10 years, where architectural photography um, as a general theme has been what's become my main focus. So it's the camera was a way to go out there and experience the world, but ultimately brought me back to the core interests, which is architecture.
During the quote unquote photography phase, right, when you were traveling the world and seeing different things and being inspired, can you give us an anecdote or two of something that really struck you and maybe influenced you up to today?
Yeah, so I mean, there's been enormous impressions, but one part of the world I've spent a lot of time is the former Soviet Union. And the first country in the former USSR that I went to was actually Kazakhstan, which was sort of on the edges of the territory. So what was interesting in that experience was that I sort of learned what the post-Soviet world was like from the total outside out. As the years went on, I shot more pictures in countries that were closer to essentially the epicenter, being Moscow. So it was a kind of an interesting experience to like learn what was actually Kazakh versus what was Soviet influence, and sort of build a whole understanding of that era and like architectural movement from the outside in. Also, watching China be built rapidly in a very short period of time in a super dramatic way, as far as the mega city and the sort of vertical um, skyscraper culture, that was also very impactful in the early years. And then since then, it's been a lot of exploring different countries that have gone through uh, rapid and extreme socio-cultural change. Like, of course, Kazakhstan and China being examples of that, but particularly the country of Georgia or Ukraine and Lebanon. Those are sort of three areas that I spend a lot of time in, and the current work is also set in most of those places as well.
Ryan, you have a book, Vantage. That's
I do.
2020.
Yes. Yeah.
How does that all come together?
So I believe it was released in the States in the end of 2019, and then the sort of worldwide in 2020. And that was a culmination of about a decade's worth of images that I had shot from essentially high up vantage points for the most part, which were with, the handheld camera, because it was sort of pre availability of commercial drones in a lot of ways. So it's always from like the top of a skyscraper or a construction crane or what have you. But it looked at the way in which our mega cities were being built and being developed, and I forget exactly how many countries it covered, but a couple dozen countries around the world, and it was focused on a sort of fine art interpretation of the architectural landscape.
When I hear Vantage, it's funny. I think it's analogous almost to your worldview. Just hearing you speak about all of your travels and your time everywhere and your thoughtfulness in terms of seeing cities be built up, and just thinking about what inspiration comes from where. Do you feel that analogy as well? Not just on top of, let's say, one building overlooking a city, but Ryan Koopmans on top of the world, really thinking about it all.
Yeah, I think that, I had a professor that coined the term real world witness, which I thought was kind of interesting because it's it's sort of like the idea of being like a fly on the wall approach to observing. And I think that's inherent to photography in general. But if you can kind of do this pull out in this sort of like macro perspective of observing humans as almost like this other species of some sort, and like the way that we live and manufacture the landscape. I think that yeah, Vantage is sort of the term itself sort of addresses that approach was like aesthetically and conceptually.
How does it feel having a book, and did this impact you having a book released at such an impactful time in human in our at least recent human history with COVID, right at the end of 19, beginning of 20, and then of course as 2020 took course. One, was that affecting you, personally where you were based at the time, and then two, did it affect the book?
Yeah, so the process of actually making the book always takes so long. So it's like by the time it actually comes out, it had been a matter of years just as far as the actual book preparation part. So because the print edition number was not particularly large, I think it was about 1,000 copies, it was not a concern or like even a priority to have a super huge um number of copies being sold. It was more about getting it placed into particular stores or private collections or what have you. So even though yeah, COVID definitely slowed everything down, it didn't affect the placement and the intent of creating a book. But what's interesting is that uh, like now that most of the work that I'm creating, if not all of it, is very much focused on screens and digital presentation. It is an experience that I think will come back in the future um, to maybe be helpful or inspire an upcoming creation of some sort, because I think that it's always nice to balance the physical and the digital in in how work is released. And I think a book is something that I would definitely be interested in releasing again in the future. It's fun with physical materials too, because even though they're, non-permanent in their physical, sort of uh, decay, that they can actually disappear over time, there is something to be said for them being these sort of objects that once they're out in the world, they're gonna sit in different people's bookshelves or coffee tables, or they can really have a life of their own, which is kind of interesting.
It's interesting too. I mean, something is being talked about a little bit more now, but for a while, the blockchain, of which of course I'm an advocate, and I believe you are too, and we're going to get into that in a minute, but um, that had been referred to for a minute there as permanent. This is permanent. But I think what we're seeing now, and what is healthy to realize, is that whether you're talking about a physical object of a book or whether you're talking about something on a blockchain, both require upkeep. Both require maintenance. Both have their own faults and flaws. I think that's important to realize.
Totally, totally. And the greatest thing though, especially for photographers, about the blockchain is the provenance, like the built-in, authorship or certificate of authorship and having created the piece. Because even with physical prints and obviously with digital files, when you put something out in the world, it had a tendency to sort of just disappear or float off into anonymity. So yeah, blockchain has massively positively uh, affected the way that work exists post creation out in the world.
We're on the same page that provenance is probably number one in terms of the value propositions of what we're doing. Dig into the digital screen a little bit more. And so we talked about the 2019-20 journey into Vantage. How does it come about that you are now creating your works on digital screen and then have the ability to then sell them?
So after years of working in documentary photography and photojournalism, technology was simultaneously changing, right? Whether it's the actual digital cameras themselves or the hardware of screens and whatnot. And the thing about photojournalism is you're not meant to embellish the image in any way, through Photoshop or removing things or changing things. And as these tools became super powerful, I started to get like the creative urge to do more with the pictures, like add some imaginative kind of input. And so the first thing that I sort of delved into was moving images, but through shooting like video locked off frames with it as video, and then different things were moving within the frame. Essentially like a photographic composition, but it's actually a video. But there was limitations on the display. It's typically like projecting it or finding like a flat screen TV or something like that to actually show it. So the movement into displaying on screens is one where I was trying to stay on the sort of forefront of what the hardware enabled. But it wasn't until really learning about tokenizing artwork that at its core, the main means of presentation was a screen. So it just totally, aligned with that kind of work. And at the same time, I just completed several pieces, which were ultimately the beginning of this project, The Wild Within, that were meant to be seen on screens. So around the same time that I first started to learn about, NFTs and was on board to SuperRare, I already had about 6 pieces that were perfectly, native to being displayed on screens.
What does the decision-making process feel like to select the first work of the series that's ultimately going to be minted?
It's quite similar to when you edit a series of photographs. There's always the the challenge of trying to remain objective when you look at the work, and often photographers are not their best editors as well, because you have all these sort of memories and, nostalgia and personal baggage and emotions that are loaded into the pictures. So it's a tricky process of trying to think really, really critically about what needs to be part of the story and what is, redundant, or what you have sort of a hang up with that you just are trying to fit in there. Um, so it's really about finding the pieces, I think, that epitomize the concept and the aesthetics in the most like pure, striking way. And often you have like an intuition, I think, like what pieces are the quote unquote bangers, the ones that are definitely strong. And then there's could be surprise ones that you have sort of overlooked, but ultimately the core work, and then it's about how do you fit in the rest to make them greater as a group than just as individuals as well.
You have an unavoidable claim to fame. You have an artwork in the collection of Jim Carey, and so I am contractually obligated to ask you about that instance and how that came together, because in that moment, I mean, people were already very aware of you, aware of your artwork. You'd already experienced great success. However, the whole world was watching, or the whole blockchain world at least was watching at that moment.
Yeah, no, it was a super exciting moment. I remember I was photographing in this like totally war-torn building in Beirut in Lebanon, and I just looked down at my phone and saw the SuperRare bot that pinged me that the piece had sold. It was actually on the market, or on uh yeah, it was like a buy it now for multiple months, and I just was already, thinking about creating the second chapter to the series, and was just, had sort of moved on from preoccupation about it. And then, long story short, it turned out that I believe it was Zach at SuperRare was approached by Jim Carey and his team because he was interested in collecting work, and that he wanted that piece because he found a connection with it. So it was, I'm Canadian and he's half Canadian, so you sort of like grow up with him being a big part of my youth and whatnot. And um so it was definitely an interesting moment, and it brought a lot of attention as well from not just the Web3 space, but also, normie news and people from that realm.
Now, before Zach tipped you off officially, did you have any indication whatsoever, or was it this thing that just hit you completely out of the clear blue sky?
Yeah, completely out of the blue.
What
Completely
a
out of the blue.
moment. What a
Yeah.
fun moment.
Yeah, and I know he worked with MoonPay to do the actual um transaction and the sort of the wallet part of it, because I don't think he had the confidence or the knowledge in how to do that. So it was like a concierge thing. But yeah, it was also really nice that he made a tweet about it, which was great. And it's I think it adds an interesting provenance to the piece. That being said, the other all the other collectors have had an equal, if not even greater, impact on the trajectory of the work as well. So it's just the benefit of this particular case was that it did bring eyes and interest from people that are totally outside of the space.
So I biased the dialogue to, of course, talk about that headliner, which is so fun. Talk about a few of your own, and not to the exclusion of anyone, as you mentioned, right? Every collector has been a huge part of the journey, but what are a couple other memorable moments as you're ushering your work into SuperRare, and now looking back a few years of a burgeoning legacy?
Yeah, well, of course, every piece it takes a long time to create, and the relationship you have with the collector is also something that develops over time and continues to this day. So every creation and collection is genuinely really special and unique and in its own right. I think that, if you just look at some of the real standout moments, the first piece going to Gabriel Santos was a big moment because minted the piece and then immediately was approached with offers right away, which was super exciting when he didn't really like been watching the space for a long time, but hadn't exposed my own work to the public in this sense. So that was a big moment. Also, Art on Internet collected 3 pieces at one point in early 2021, which was also very interesting because we immediately had a call afterwards, which was just really reinforcing one of the great things about this way of collecting art, and that you have this one-on-one dialogue and an ability to actually connect with the collector. So that was special. And yeah, like, everyone along the way has really been a unique and significant uh, exchange and relationship that's formed out of it. It's also really fun to meet the collectors in real life at some point afterwards, usually. And yeah, that's meeting in real life at these different NFT events, whether it's Art Basel or in New York or where have you, is also a really fun and unique and special part of the space.
Hearing you even speak about collectors and just the respect for the symbiosis and the uniqueness of what Web3 offers in that realm, it's no surprise you're also a great collaborator. And I'm a fan of collaboration. I think it produces some very interesting works and some sparks that you may not otherwise experience. And in your case, you have 3 pretty distinct and special collaboration. Well, actually, I should say we're going to get into your current one in a second, but I'm talking specifically about the 3 artists that you collaborated with, being Kath Samar, being TJO, and being Bado. So take us through those collaborations. I'm curious to learn more.
Yeah, the collab with Kath was actually the first one. And I think with Kath, I identify a lot and respect her approach to how she creates work. You know, she devotes everything to photography and has this like totally die hard work ethic, as well as taking pictures in a totally different time of day that I usually do. Um, but also recognizing like the sense of scale in the landscape is something I identify with, especially like with my sort of architectural landscape past interests. So I really like her work and her approach to it. And it was an interesting opportunity to make the first piece that was outside of daytime, because all the other pieces were in daytime. And then TJO was based, that collaboration arose because there was this specific building that I had explored in Italy, which has a really, you know, complex history as this psychiatric institute. And it just reading the history about the place and doing as much research as I could, it just really made me think of the sort of subject matter that which Tijo really delves into. And that was a piece that we really infused both of our sort of styles into. You know, he made the textures on the wall, and then there was this big Baroque painting frame, which just felt like the perfect thing to frame one of his pieces in. And it was also the first time making a dynamic piece, which switched from day to night. So we thought of the sort of the dichotomy of the mind and the light and the dark and these sort of psychological aspects. Also, the plants that are in the space in the room are different species that are either sort of medicinal or, you know, like could be used for some therapeutic purposes. So it all sort of had this psychiatric theme to it. And then Bodo was a collaboration. My partner, my wife, Alice, we work together on a lot of this. We had a show in Montreal, and Simon Hudson at Bodo, who's one of the, you know, the main stewards of Bodo, suggested collaborating is like the first collaborative piece with Bodo. And we'd already been following Bodo since they first connected with SuperRare, which I think was, you know, 2021 when they did the token exchange. And we've been a big fan ever since. And essentially what was so interesting about that collaboration was that a lot of the themes that we are interested in are the same as that Bodo uh, epitomizes. And so, long story short, Bodo has these fragments that they have pieces that are generated which don't go to mint, and they're voted on, and they might be like, you know, almost the piece that made it to be a Bodo one of one, but they stay in this pool. So we took a selection of those pieces that were voted on by the DAO to incorporate into this old, deteriorated room. So we both had this sort of conceptual parallel with the idea of resurgence, of like recycling and reviving of these old discarded fragments. So that was a really interesting collaboration. And even though it was very much like a DAO led artist with multiple opinions and multiple, you know, people's input and the whole voting process, it still really felt like we were collaborating with an individual artist that had its own, you know, autonomous, like sovereign ideas and styles and everything. So that was a really interesting experience.
It's a special collaboration. It got my mind running. As some people may know, listening to this, Simon Hudson was, I believe, the 5th guest of the Future of Art. And we had a fantastic breakdown of Bodo. And ever since, I've really become a fan, you know, become more of a fan than I already was of how they carry themselves, meaning the DAO, and how that process all comes together. Very, very thoughtful. So just sitting here talking to you, listening to you speak about it, pretty meaningful to be the first collaborator with a quote unquote decentralized autonomous artist.
Yeah, no, it's a big honor, and I totally agree. Like just through the process of working on this collaboration, became a bigger, even bigger fan of Bodo, and Simon is, so sharp and such a intelligent person that he he is a great like sort of mediator to to deal with Bodo, because Bodo can't communicate for itself. So he's a great steward for Bodo.
Let's leap to present day, because you have a very special work recently released, and it's in collaboration with Transient Labs, who we have a great deal of respect for. And I find it interesting that as you go back through some of these works, you're planting, or at least in my mind, you're planting these seeds, you're experimenting with time of day, right? Night and day with the TJO piece. And then you go into collaboration with Bodo with some interesting components. And then now you're here exploring the, dynamism, dynamic artwork again.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things about creating work on the blockchain is that you have the ability or the capacity to make things like dynamic work that interacts with various aspects of daily life, or device, depending on the time of day, or things that really change. And so therefore, yeah, dynamic work, and specifically with Transient Labs, has always really epitomized the what I think is cool and exciting about creating work in this medium. Um, it's often a case of really having to think like consciously why something would be dynamic, and taking like very considered steps into how much you infuse into it, because you want to make sure that like aesthetically it's still on point, and that conceptually the making it dynamic, it really could contribute something to it, just rather than for the sake of it being a gimmick or something. So yeah, it's like a very considered process, but I think when you can do it right, like how they do with many of the artists that they have released work with, it really becomes something super interesting. And they're like again, a very intelligent and capable and like hardworking team. It's such a pleasure to work with, and they're really artist focused and artist first. So it really feels like if you that you can think about work in the most like imaginative, creative, biggest idea possible, because they sort of instill that like confidence and ability to do what needs to be done to make that happen, which I think is really cool. It really helps you like constantly push and think of like the most cutting edge ideas that you can. And yeah, so this piece is a time-based work, or in the sense that it interacts with the time of day of the viewer's device. And there's it also switches between night and day at 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. So it sort of just goes along the same theme of wanting to create work that people could actually live with, and have like an actual interactive relationship with, um, as they have it displayed in their house, for instance. So I just think that it's fun, and it's an exciting way to infuse sort of extra elements in the work.
So the Enchanted Hour is the title of the piece. And how did you choose an owl?
It's the room itself that the place is set in is this old like Baroque villa in Italy that's sort of really nestled in the woods, and it just sort of has this um haunting but non sort of sinister kind of vibe to it. And the circular frame that was above the fireplace actually didn't contain any image. It had been ripped out, or destroyed essentially. So it just felt like the perfect creature to be there was an owl that was sort of perched up in this forest like environment, and would also be like suitable to be a creature that flies around when the clock strikes 12 kind of thing. Also, it sort of evoked the piece itself evoked a sense of a cuckoo clock. And I thought that it, if there's going to be a bird coming out that's of the right size, of the right sort of ecological, context, that a great horned owl would be the perfect example.
When you are sufficiently through the creative process, or correct me, maybe even before the creative process, how do you choose your release methodology? Meaning anything from, I know you predominantly are releasing one of one artworks, so there's edition count, but then there's also the mechanics behind setting a reserve price or a list price, as you mentioned earlier with the Jim Carey artwork. How do you go through that process?
I think you always have to reassess what the most suitable approach is, and different artists have widely different approaches to that, with often with huge success. So I think for the work that I've released, the idea has been to really put a lot of focus on the specific piece and have, a limited amount of available supply that's actually for sale. That being said, create a ton of work all the time and constantly be making work, but just don't necessarily mint it. That's sort of been the approach. Um, Also, as far as pricing goes, I have found a preference for prices as opposed to reserves, although there's been cases where it's set a zero reserve. Like for instance, the bottle collaboration was a zero ETH reserve. Um, the idea of like the value of the work going up over time is something that acknowledge and try to sustain, because I think that, if I bought something, I would also appreciate it if the monetary value of the collection went up over time, essentially. So without preoccupying on that, I definitely would like to protect the investment of previous collectors and have a sort of sustainable but upward trajectory over time as far as how the work is priced.
I appreciate the level of thoughtfulness to several things now. You've expressed that with regard to the choice to mint a work and essentially leaving things on not necessarily the cutting room floor, but just like you said, consistently creating, but then being very selective about what actually makes it on blockchain and being deliberate about that. And then the dynamism piece interested me when you said, hey, I don't want to create something dynamically just as a gimmick. I want this to make sense. I want this to be additive or multiplicative to the piece itself. And then the same thing now with collectors. So considering their standpoint and what, without obsessing on it, like you said, but just being aware of how they may be feeling and the trajectory that you're riding together. I appreciate those three levels of thoughtfulness.
I think that all of those, three different ideas, the one common thread between them is the idea of longevity, that you want the work to last for a long time, and you want the value to last, and the significance of it. And the if we talk about permanence, like you can burn pieces, but they don't actually get burned, right? Like there is this sort of degree of permanence that, especially now looking back on the last few years, I really recognize the importance of consciously releasing what you do, because it's going to be there. And if it's not like the best possible work, or you haven't considered all aspects of what the consequences of releasing something, then that's not ideal. So just thinking about everything in a really long-term sense is sort of been the approach to how I've looked at things thus far.
Ryan, I'll ask you a very broad question and you can choose exactly how to answer it. So you can drill down, you can stay broad, you can go personal, you can go outward to the space. Where's this all going?
It's I mean, it's going where my interests and curiosities continue to pull me. I think that there's, a big influence of the geopolitical changing world, and as different parts of the world, different things happen, it sort of molds my interests into different ways, but it's all very much following the sort of core thread, which looks at the way that we coexist with this planet, and the infrastructural, architectural markings that we make through that relationship, that journey. It's a combination of, or the future of the work is a combination of, a lot of like planning and researching and trying to construct a long-term sustainable narrative that can continue to grow and change as technology changes and new tools come to the table. But there's also a huge aspect of the unknown and responding to the, dynamic changes that I'm faced with.
How many ideas do you have in motion at one particular moment in time? Are you somebody who is all in and obsessing over a singular idea until it reaches completion? Do you have several things in progress at once?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's often multiple locations, like cities or countries or cultures that I'm interested in at a given time. But it takes so much, to research and commitment to the actual thing, that it tends to be that I've become like very obsessed with one place and one area at a time. As far as individual pieces go, there's usually a couple of pieces that are being built and sort of, experimented with at once. But I would say that it's, if you have to pick one of the two, it's a bit more of a like one piece at a time, one focus at a time approach. But sometimes, if some new idea or new technology or opportunity or something comes up, then you put the other project on, or the other piece and idea on the side, and go 100% into the new thing. So you have to be flexible, is sort of the ultimate thing, is that I've tried to be very flexible in all aspects of creating, while still having that real, like, North Star or uh artistic kind of intention behind what you're doing.
Give us a quick peek behind the curtain of, let's say, a location obsession. Let's say a location strikes you. How does that process begin? Do you have to go visit the location? I'm curious.
It's often a place that I've had some sort of exposure to in the past, and learning about over the years, and you sort of piece it together, your understanding and contacts and all of that. So, for instance, Georgia, the country of Georgia, has probably been the biggest impact on the last 5-6 years of creating, and that country actually began with me being invited there to photograph their fashion week about 10 years ago. So it's when I first went to the city, Tbilisi, and thought, wow, this is like a super interesting place that has layers of history, and all these different empires have converged in this one kind of obscure, relatively unknown city. And then through exploring the country, learning about different parts of it, and finding different regions that have all these sort of surreal and extreme qualities. And then basically a 6-year long relationship of going back and learning more and meeting people, and having different types of projects there, and building like a long-term relationship with the place is often how it goes. And you still always discover new things that you wouldn't expect about buildings or locations or towns or whatever that you thought you really knew about. So there's a lot to uncover.
Taking a location like Georgia with clearly inspiration and longevity behind it, do you go back and share with friends in Georgia artworks that are created with inspiration taken from there?
For sure. Yeah.
Amazing.
And it's also been because of being able to actually sell some of these pieces, it's also given the opportunity to give back to some of those communities, whether it's through sponsoring the stray dog pandemic or epidemic that they have in certain parts of the country, or giving laptops and uh, equipment to kids in the town, or supported a whole like garbage cleanup initiative in one of the buildings. And you can actually like find different ways to give back to the community, which is rewarding. And I also think as a photographer is something that some photographers will feel a bit of a responsibility to, because you're going there and you're creating these images based on their reality, and then you leave and monetize those pictures. So there's kind of like this innate desire to share with those people who are from the particular place.
The term symbiosis rears its head again.
Yeah, and actually, like one of my main contacts in Georgia, I met. He was 16 at the time, and was referred to him because he was the only person in this one town that spoke English, apparently. And he was just like this kid from this rural town who learned how to speak English on YouTube, and became essentially my translator, sort of like what we call fixer, for the years to come, and was actually just came to our wedding like 2 months ago. Yeah, brought him in from Georgia to our wedding in Sweden. Alice and I got married. So you form like actually these real connections with the people as well.
Incredible. And congratulations on the wedding.
Thank you. Thank you.
Still just a few months after. Amazing.
Thank you. Georgia was also super excited in general about Jim Carey having collected a piece. So they were very proud and excited about that.
That's so fun.
Yeah.
My favorite part of that story is how out of the clear blue sky these things happen sometimes. I think, excuse me, sometimes cynicism in some of us dictates, oh, well, that had to be planned, or oh, what was happening behind the scenes. But when something truly does happen out of the blue, it's so fun.
Yeah, totally.
And then with how well traveled you are, just that you're going across the world, and experiencing something, and then those people around you that you've already formed relationships with, they get to feel that sense of surprise and pleasure as well.
Yeah, for sure.
So Ryan, outside of your own work, when you look across, roughly speaking, digital art, let's say digital art framed on blockchain, what's something outside of yourself that inspires you?
I think that people who use the technology and the tools in really interesting and unique ways that you couldn't do just with physical mediums is super inspiring. Like, I mean, there's tons of examples, but say someone like ACK is a great example of someone who really epitomizes the moment and this technology. I think that's very exciting. And so that's why like dynamic NFTs, for instance, is something that I think is very interesting, because it could only be done in this, context for the most part. I think the crossover between artists that create in Web3 and also have a presence in the traditional art world is interesting, because of all different reasons. But it's nice to see when their work is being displayed like publicly on a really large scale, or gets attention from the wider mainstream public. I think that's also inspiring and interesting. Or when museums acquire pieces, I think that's all great. I think it contributes positively to the long-term existence and significance of what everyone's doing here right now.
Ryan, who should be on the future of art? And I have to rule out two names. I have to rule out Alpha Centauri Kid and Simon Hudson, because they've both been guests. But who else comes to mind?
Ruben Wu. Have you spoken with him? Yeah.
I am a big fan of Ruben. He's not been on the show yet. I would love to have that conversation.
Yeah, I think, and Ruben Wu is someone I've, whose work I've really appreciated long before my entrance in Web3. Claire Silver is very interesting. I heard her speak in Lisbon recently at the NFC conference about her work, and it was very, very interesting and compelling. So if you haven't spoken to her yet,
Those are two great
I
ones.
think, yeah, I think she's good. And I mean, there's a lot of super interesting artists, but those are just two that come to mind with people that I think have a lot to say.
Tell people where they can find you, what you'd like to point people to. I know we've already spoken about the Enchanted Hour, your current work with Transient, but say it in your own words. Where do you want to send people?
So on Twitter, I'm at Ryan Koopmans, and to see all the pieces that have been released over the last few years, Alice and I created a site which is thewildwithin.xyz, and there you can get quite an overview of the pieces we've spoken about and collaborations, and it's sort of the central hub of where all the information is being um, accumulated in one spot to show the work and the plans and the ideas behind it all. So that's the wildwithin.xyz.
Amazing. Ryan, thank you so much for spending the time. It's been an enjoyable conversation. It's been a long time coming, been aware of your work for several years now, and I look forward to doing it again, maybe a little bit down the line.
Thank you. And super nice to speak with you, and keep it up with the podcast. It's very interesting to hear all these different thoughts and experiences. And thank you again.
Appreciate that. Onward. Thank you for listening and for being part of the future of art. If you liked the episode, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite platform, and onward to the many conversations that await us. The Future of Art is produced by Artifex. Artifex, Artifex, was created to honor today's top digital fine artists in 3 dimensions. Each artist's one-of-one work of art becomes a collectible 3D sculpture and centerpiece of an immersive world built in Unreal Engine, the creation tool of Epic Games. Search Artifex Viewer on Apple and download our brand new free app to experience the sculptures in augmented reality. And visit artifex.art/unreal to literally step inside the art on your browser.